chose to do my paper and my presentation over autism spectrum disorder called Asperger syndrome. It was discovered in 1944 by a man named Hans Asperger. He observed 4 children who seemed to be socially awkward, and at the end of his study, he called their syndrome autistic psychopathy. And in 1981, an English woman named Lorna Wing called it Asperger syndrome and made it more known to people throughout the world because Hans Asperger did his studies in German and she translated them and made them more known. In 1992, it was added to the ICD-10, and in 1994, it was added to the DSM-4. The case study that I chose is called Life Through Glass by Wendy Lawson. She was 42 years old when she was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, and before this diagnosis, her psychotherapist thought that she was schizophrenic, had postpartum depression, and was clinically depressed also. In her book, she describes many social problems that she had as a child, and when she got older, she describes her marital problems, her 2 suicide attempts, and her bouts with depression. The symptoms of Asperger's syndrome can be different for each case, but in typical symptoms are obsession with one object. A person with Asperger's syndrome might gather facts and information, like impulsively and obsessively, about one subject. Their conversation will always be geared toward this subject, and their conversation can seem egocentric because they don't understand verbal cues is like the way that a conversation goes. One person talks and then another person talks. They'll just talk incessantly, likely about their topic of choice. Their speech can lack rhythm. It can seem monotone and sometimes not make sense. They can seem socially awkward and therefore isolate themselves because they don't understand how to make friends with others. In Wendy's case, when she was younger, she had no desire to make friends, and she only friended her cat and her dog. And she didn't know how to express her emotions, so her way of expressing her emotion towards her animals was to imitate them. So she would often drink out of a saucer with her cat. Her parents knew that this was awkward, but they didn't think that anything was clinically wrong with her. So they never took her to any therapist or psychiatrist to seek help for this. Also, people with Asperger's syndrome are likely to become depressed in their older years because they realize that they're not like everyone else and that they have a desire to make friends but just don't know how to go about doing it. So their socially awkwardness and their isolation is likely to lead to depression. With Wendy's diagnosis when she turned 42, she found it very difficult to receive this information because she had, for a while, thought that she was schizophrenic. She read about schizophrenia and clinical depression, and she just didn't think that all these symptoms matched her disorder, what she was going through. Some of them did, but most of them didn't. So with this new information, she read more about other disorders, and she went to see a psychiatrist who eventually diagnosed her with Asperger's syndrome. It's also known as high-functioning autism. And he came to this diagnosis because of Wendy's lack of eye contact. For example, when she was studying to be a social worker, she was talking with another girl that was studying to be a social worker as practice, and the entire time that the girl was talking to her, Wendy didn't look at her one time. She didn't even look in her direction. And after the girl was done talking, she was very upset with Wendy because she felt like she wasn't paying attention to her. But Wendy didn't understand that she was listening to her just fine. And then the girl explained to her that when you look at someone in their eyes when they're talking, it helps them to think that you're really listening to them. Wendy took this into consideration, explaining to the girl that she listened to her very well, but it was easy for her to listen when she wasn't looking at someone in their eyes, which is typical of people with Asperger's syndrome. But from this, she learned that looking at people in their eyes, or at least in their direction, helps them to feel that she's actually listening to them. So she practices this more often. Wendy's aloofness led to her diagnosis with Asperger's syndrome, and sometimes people with this disorder don't respond to their name all the time, and they have a lack of body language when they're talking, and they don't display nonverbal and verbal cues as those without Asperger syndrome would. And they don't always respond to nonverbal cues. For example, Wendy had a hard time understanding people's emotions. For example, when she was young, her mother had a baby who died just a few days after its birth. And she didn't understand what the emotions were that her family was feeling. She realized that there wasn't music playing in the house anymore and that everything just seemed a little grayer. So she came to the conclusion that they were sad. It took her, as opposed to someone without Asperger's syndrome, just understanding that their death and their crying equals sadness. It took Wendy a long time and a couple of extra hints to understand what her family was feeling. As opposed to clinical autism, people with Asperger syndrome normally don't have any cognitive delays. They could sometimes be a little clumsier physically, but they don't have any cognitive delays as people with classical autism might have. There is no cure for Asperger syndrome, but there are therapies and behavioral interventions that one can go through to help them to cope with their symptoms and to learn more and understand more about their disorder. This is what Wendy did. She sought out the help of a psychiatrist and the help of others. For example, at her job, she would often get a bad feeling from others, especially professionals in her field. And she just let the people that she worked with know about her disorder, and they just help her through on a daily basis so that she doesn't feel ostracized or misunderstood by them. But most behavioral and interventive therapies focus on improving social interaction so that it leads to a person with Asperger syndrome feeling less ostracized or isolated, and therefore can lessen their chance of having depression. And it improves the behavioral therapy can focus on improving verbal and nonverbal communication, which, as I said before, is hard for people with Asperger syndrome to understand. And lastly, it helps people with Asperger syndrome to not ritualize and perform their obsessive, repetitive routines. In Wendy's case, when she was a child, she would play on the playground all by herself. She would, most of the time, sit on the concrete and hold her arms together, rock back and forth, and suck on the roof of her mouth. It gave her a sense of security, and it made her feel comfortable. She also ritualized whenever she was anxious or angry or depressed, or just whenever there was a lot going on in her house and she couldn't take all of the activity. This is what she would do because it made her feel comfortable. Also, medications, antidepressant medications, and sometimes anti-anxiety medications are prescribed with people with Asperger syndrome, as they were in Wendy's case. This is just because it's likely for people with Asperger syndrome to become depressed because of their isolation, especially if they don't seek out any behavioral therapy or interventions to help them to understand their disorder more. As for the prognosis for Asperger syndrome, it will normally progress naturally. However, with therapies, it can help with as the disorder progresses. Without treatment, it's likely that the person won't fully understand their disorder, and they won't grow in their social life as they could with the therapy. In Wendy's case, she sought out a psychiatrist. She understood and learned more about her disease, and then she went on to teach parents of children with Asperger syndrome more about their disease, because her parents didn't understand her disease, and they didn't understand why she did the things she did, and they perhaps unintentionally ostracized her as well. But when she got older and she came to understand her disease, she went back and she told her mother, her father had died, before she could get a chance to tell him. But then she understood more, and they were very surprised to hear of her disease, her disorder, because they simply thought that she was just a little awkward and a little different. But, however, social interaction can improve with therapy, and Wendy helps parents of children to understand this, and through writing her book and through her social work, she hopes to help people with and without Asperger syndrome to understand more about the disorder so that they could be more sensitive to it and more sensitive to the needs of those with Asperger syndrome, as to not isolate them and make them feel more alone and perhaps lead to their depression and their suicide attempts, as it did in Wendy's case. From this book, I've learned a lot about Asperger syndrome, of course, but it's also, as Wendy hoped to do, made me more sensitive to the needs of those with Asperger syndrome or other autism spectrum disorders.